Okay, everybody, if you're ready, we are at the point where we're ready to delve into looking at some code. Now, at this point, you should have gotten yourself set up with an account on Expo Snack, and if possible, you would have installed the Expo Go apps on your devices so that we can test our code directly on the device rather than having to wait in line for the emulators. Okay, so now we're ready. Now we can actually write some code. So here we are in the editor. Now, I shared with you before that the language that we're going to be using is called React Native, which actually isn't a different language. It's actually it's probably more accurate to describe it as a dialect of JavaScript. So it's JavaScript with some extra stuff on top of it. And React Native is a product of Facebook. It's supported by Facebook, so there's kind of some big guns behind it. It's kind of interesting that in the industry, computer science, in the tech industry, I should say, kind of the trend has been that these big companies like Google and Facebook, they have in-house needs. They need to write some code for their own products, and they often will share that with everybody else, with the public. So that's the case in this case. Facebook has, they had an in-house need to write some code for designing apps, of course, and when they finished that code base, they kind of shared it with the public, and so they're kind of supporting it and sharing it with us, so we kind of benefit from that. So React Native is as I said before, it's kind of a dialect of JavaScript, would probably be the most accurate way to describe it. But when we start looking at it, we're also going to see there's some elements of HTML and CSS. So it's kind of, I would say it's kind of like taking all three languages, JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, and kind of just mishmashing them together, getting kind of just like a mixture of the three. Okay, so what they give us, so when you first log into your Expo Snack account, you get some skeleton code. So this code really just is kind of like a demo code. And you can see on the right here on the emulator, this is what it would look like if you ran it in your device. Okay, so you can actually try running it on your device if you like. If you go to your device and you log into your Expo account, you want to make sure you save it first. So if you don't save it, then it's not available. But once you save it, then you can actually run it on your device. And you'd see a page that looks like this. You can kind of see here, it just has a message at the top, change code in the editor and watch it change on your phone, save to get a shareable URL. And then there's a picture beneath it. Okay, so this code here in the editor is what gives us this on our app. Okay, now let's take a look at it. So in this unit, we're going to learn by doing. I'm kind of not a huge fan of the textbook way of learning where you start with chapter 1 and you learn, okay, this is how you define a variable, and then this is how you write a loop, and then this is how you write a conditional. I like to learn by doing. And the textbook way, you get through the whole textbook and still you haven't really done anything. You haven't really written an app yet. So this way, we're going to learn by doing. Okay, and so we're going to just delve right in and take a look. So what I want you to look at, now a lot of this, of course, is going to be a little unfamiliar to you because we haven't studied React Native, that dialect of JavaScript. But if you look at it carefully, don't just turn off. If you look at it carefully, you're going to start to see some patterns and you're going to start to see some similarities. And we can leverage those similarities with what we know to help us get a foothold in how to use React Native and start to write some neat code that will run, on your phone right off the bat. Okay, so let's take a look. Now I'm going to point out to you that this program is divided. Basically, there's 3 sections in a React Native app code. Okay, so there's the top section here. So if you look at, say, let me highlight it here. So that set of lines right there, say from line 1 through line 9. If you look at those lines carefully, they all start with the word import. Okay, so the top of your program is what's called the import section. Okay, what is importing? Well, the neat thing about programming is that once you start to have people write code in your language, there's often sharing that goes on. So people write some code that does this neat thing or does this useful thing, and they'll share it with the rest of the world. So when you want to use that code, if you need to do that same process or you need to use that same tool in your code, your own code, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to start from scratch and rewrite everything yourself. You can take advantage of stuff that other people have already done, the work that they've done, to write the code that does that for you. And so that's kind of a neat feature of programming, is people are really generous in sharing. And so they create what are called libraries. A library is just a set of code that does a certain thing that people have already figured out how to do it. And so when you need to use that code, you need to do that certain thing, you don't need to write your own code from scratch. You can just use their stuff. So how to use their stuff? Well, you import it. So importing is bringing in code, external code that somebody else has already written that does something that you want to do so that you don't have to write the code yourself from scratch. Okay, so most React Native programs, you're going to see start at the top with the import section. So this section is where we import, we pull in all the external code that we want to use in our program. So we don't have to write it all ourselves from scratch. Okay, so you see there's a bunch of them. Now, don't worry too much about the syntax. Don't worry, okay, why does some stuff have the curly braces around it and other stuff doesn't? What is that asterisk in line 1? Don't worry too much about that stuff yet. Don't focus on the details, kind of look at the big picture. So the big picture is that we start at the top with an import section. So all of the external code that other people have already written, these so-called libraries of code, we're going to pull them into our program so we don't have to write stuff from scratch ourselves. So our programs are going to be a lot shorter because of that. So the top section is the import section. Okay, then you have this middle section here that starts about line 11 and goes down to about line 22. Okay, now if you look at that, now of course there's going to be some things that are unfamiliar there. But if you look at that's basically JavaScript. So what we're doing in that section is we're making a function called app. And that's what's called the main entry point for our application. So when you first open up the app on your device, it starts running that function, the code in that function called app. And that's always got to be called app. That's one thing about React Native. You can't change the name of that function, otherwise you're going to get some errors. Okay, so that's kind of what we call the entry point. So there's some basically JavaScript code in the middle there. So that code in the middle section is where we write the JavaScript code to actually do what we want the app to do. That's where the functionality of the app comes in, is in that middle section, right? Some Java code there. Now, if you look also carefully there, you might see some stuff that kind of looks like HTML. You see some tags. So like I see right there, looks like a view tag. There's the angle brackets. There's a text, looks like a text tag. There's kind of like, you can see there's like a closing tag right there, closing text tag. So there's some stuff in there that kind of looks like HTML. So kind of like a mishmash of JavaScript with HTML. Okay, but this middle section here though, from about line 11 to about line 22, this is the JavaScript part. This is where we actually program up the app. This is where the functionality comes in. Okay, and then there's a third section at the bottom. Okay, so that's kind of the bottom here, down there. Okay, so that third section now, when you look at it, you see the word styles there. It starts with like line 24, it says const styles. So that's kind of a hint, that's kind of a clue that, oh, okay, this stuff has to do with styling. So this is like CSS stuff when we're doing websites. Now, again, some of the specifics, the details of it, going to look a little unfamiliar, but that's okay. We're going to get used to that. So you see there's like there's something called a container, and then inside it, you see there's some similar things. You see kind of some similar keywords to what you might have seen in CSS. There's a justify padding. We've seen that before in CSS. Background color. You see kind of like there's a hex code there. So there's a lot of similar things. So this third section right here has to do with the styling. So if you want to if in a normal website, if you wanted to do stuff with CSS, you wanted to change the styling, adjust, font, spacing, colors, that kind of stuff, and that's where that would occur. So that would occur in this third section on the bottom. Okay, and you can kind of see this kind of like classes. You have a container, it's sort of like CSS, you have a container class where you have these certain styles that you're applying. Then you have another style for a paragraph class, and then you have these other like margins and padding and so forth that you define. Okay, so the bottom section is the styling section. Okay, so you got 3 basic sections to your app. You got the top section, the import section. This is where you pull in outside code that you want to use in your app. Then you have the middle section. This is the main program section. This is where the actual code is. So this is what's responsible for creating the app and putting it on the screen. There's some, it looks like there's some HTML mishmashed in there, but basically JavaScript. And then the third section here, this is the styling section. So this is where you would see some stuff that's kind of similar to CSS. Okay, so when I say React Native, it's kind of like a mishmash of all three languages, JavaScript, CSS, HTML. I wasn't kidding, because in your one program here, one application file here, all three things you kind of see. Okay, now, again, don't worry too much about the small details. If you're a detail-oriented person, kind of look at the big picture. The big picture is there are some similarities. You see a lot of similarities with JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. A lot of stuff shoved in there. And in our program, there's three basic sections: the import section, the main code section, and then the styling section. Okay, so that's kind of the layout of a React Native program. Now, in the next video that you're going to watch, I'm going to show you kind of how you think about breaking down and designing your app. We're going to break down the code. So we're not just going to have one long file where we have our entire program. People have found that it's better to break it up into small chunks, to chunk it, and we're going to discuss how that works. Okay, but this is the basic layout of a React Native program.